There are confessions that age inside a man's chest like fine wine, growing heavier with each passing year until silence becomes unbearable. I have served the Harrington family for 27 years as their estate manager, maintaining their Fifth Avenue mansion and ensuring their privacy remains absolute. In all that time, I never spoke about the monthly ritual they conducted in the Blue Room, not even to my wife, not even to myself in the quiet hours before dawn. But 40 years have passed since that night in November of 1985, and I find that secrets have their own weight, their own need for release. The Harringtons are gone now. The last of them died 3 months ago in Switzerland, and with their departure, certain obligations have been lifted from my shoulders. The family ritual occurred every third Thursday of each month, precisely at 9 o'clock in the evening. For over 2 decades, I would prepare the Blue Room according to instructions that had been written down by Theodore, Harrington's great-grandfather, in 1897. 12 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each positioned exactly 18 inches from its neighbours. Crystal glasses filled with water from their private well in the Adirondacks. White candles in silver holders, never lit by matches but by tapers that had been blessed by Father McKinnon at St. Bartholomew's. 23 family members would gather: grandparents, parents, children, cousins, even distant relatives who travelled from Europe for these occasions. The ritual lasted exactly 90 minutes, during which I was forbidden from entering that wing of the house, until the night when only one chair was prepared. November 21st, 1985, began like any other ritual Thursday. I arrived at the mansion at 6 o'clock in the morning, my key turning in the service entrance as it had for thousands of previous days. Mrs. Harrington's instructions waited in their usual placer. Cream-coloured envelope on the kitchen counter bearing my name in her precise Palmer method handwriting. William, the note began, tonight's gathering requires modified arrangements. Please prepare only one chair in the Blue Room, positioned at the circle's centre. 1 glass of water, 1 candle. The family will not be joining us this evening. You are expected to attend in their place at 9 o'clock sharp. Wear your formal attire and bring nothing else. What occurs tonight has been planned for some time. I read the note 3 times before its meaning settled into my mind. In 27 years of service, I had never been invited to participate in their monthly ritual. My role was preparation and discretion, nothing more. The family had been clear about this boundary from my first day of employment. The ritual was private, hereditary, and absolutely not my concern. Yet here was Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, matriarch of a family whose wealth dated back to railroad investments in the 1860s, explicitly requesting my attendance. The note was signed with her full name rather than the usual EH, suggesting formality that bordered on legal documentation. I spent the day performing my usual duties with unusual distraction. The greenhouse orchids received extra attention. The silver was polished to an unnecessary brilliance. I found myself straightening picture frames that hung perfectly level, adjusting curtains that needed no adjustment. At 8 o'clock that evening, I changed into the formal attire that Mrs. Harrington had specified. Black suit, white shirt, conservative tie, shoes polished to mirror brightness. The Blue Room awaited my preparation, its mahogany doors closed as they had been since the previous month's gathering. Inside, the room felt different despite appearing identical to my memory. Tall windows faced Central Park, their heavy curtains drawn against the November darkness. Persian rugs covered sections of the polished hardwood floor, their intricate patterns seeming more complex under the overhead chandelier's electric light. Oil portraits of Harrington ancestors watched from gilt frames, their painted eyes following my movements as I worked. I positioned a single queen and chair at the room's centre, its burgundy velvet upholstery catching the light. 1 crystal glass filled with Adirondack water went on the small table beside it. One white candle in its silver holder, the blessed taper waiting in the adjacent drawer. The modifications felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. 27 years of arranging 12 chairs in a precise circle had created muscle memory that rebelled against this singular placement. The room's proportions, designed for multiple occupants, made the solitary chair appear abandoned rather than ceremonial. 9 o'clock approached with unusual heaviness. I had attended thousands of dinners, board meetings, and social gatherings in my capacity as estate manager. But never had I felt such reluctance to enter a room in the Harrington mansion. Something about tonight's arrangement suggested that I was crossing a threshold from which return might not be possible. At precisely 9 o'clock, I opened the blue room doors and stepped inside. The room was not empty. 23 figures occupied chairs that had not been there during my preparation 30 minutes earlier. The circle I remembered from decades of monthly arrangements surrounded my single chair, each position filled by a Harrington family member I recognised despite their unusual stillness. Eleanor Harrington sat directly across from my designated place, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her evening dress impeccable, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her, Theodore Harrington maintained his customary rigid posture, gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. Their children, their siblings, their cousins all present in their familiar positions, all motionless as portraits, all facing inward toward the chair that awaited my occupancy. None of them looked at me as I entered. Their gazes remained fixed on some point in the empty air above the centre of the circle. Their expressions peaceful but distant, as if they were listening to music I could not hear. No one spoke. No one acknowledged my presence. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft whisper of my shoes against the Persian rugs. I approached the central chair with the careful steps of a man walking through a museum after hours, uncertain whether I was an invited guest or an inadvertent trespasser. The blessed taper lay beside the silver candle holder, waiting for me to complete the ritual's opening ceremony as I had witnessed Mrs. Harrington do on those rare occasions when the blue room doors had been left ajar during my cleaning duties. I sat down in the chair and reached for the taper. The moment my fingers touched its wax surface, 23 voices spoke in perfect unison. "Welcome, William Morrison," they said, their voices blending into a single tone that seemed to come from the room itself rather than from individual throats. "The family has waited 27 years for this night." My surname stopped me cold. I had been William Foster for 53 years. Since my birth in Queens to parents who had immigrated from County Cork, I had married Catherine Foster, raised two children as Fosters, built a career around the reliability of being William Foster, estate manager. The name Morrison belonged to someone else entirely, or so I had always believed. "Your grandfather," Eleanor Harrington's voice continued, though her lips did not move and her gaze remained fixed on the empty air above my head, was Thomas Morrison of County Donegal. He came to New York in 1892 carrying documents that he sold to our family for safe passage and a new identity. Those documents concerned a matter that required permanent resolution. The other family members began speaking in rotation, their voices maintaining that same unified tone. Thomas Morrison witnessed something in Ireland that he was paid to forget. He changed his name to Thomas Foster and married a woman who believed his stories about coming from Cork. The documents he sold contained testimony about events in Donegal that certain parties preferred to remain unrecorded. "Your family has carried our secret for 3 generations without knowing it." I tried to speak, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but found that my voice would not obey my intentions. The taper remained in my hand, unlit, while the 23 figures continued their revelation with patient precision. The Morrison family, Theodore Harrington's voice joined the chorus, lived on land that the Harrington Railroad needed for westward expansion. When they refused to sell, alternative arrangements became necessary. Your grandfather witnessed the fire that was meant to appear accidental. 11 people died in that fire, including Thomas Morrison's parents, his wife, and his 3 young children. Only Thomas survived because he was in the village that evening, drinking away his grief over recent financial losses. The room grew colder as their voices continued. Thomas was offered a choice: testify about what he had seen, or accept payment for a new life in America with documentation that would erase Thomas Morrison forever. He chose survival over justice. The payment he received was substantial enough to secure passage to New York and establish himself as Thomas Foster, a County Cork immigrant with no history of tragedy. My grandfather, the gentle man who had told me stories about Irish countryside, about ancestors who had farmed green hills near Cork, about a family history that stretched back centuries in peaceful rural communities. All lies. All stories created to cover the truth about burned houses and murdered. Families and railway expansion that brooked no opposition. Thomas Morrison signed documents swearing that the fire was accidental, that he had seen no evidence of deliberate action, that the Morrison family had simply been unlucky victims of faulty chimney construction. In exchange, he received money and passage to America, plus legal documents establishing Thomas Foster as his legitimate identity. But secrets have their own weight, their own need for acknowledgement. For 93 years, the unified voice continued. The Harrington family has conducted these monthly gatherings to maintain Thomas Morrison's silence. Each ritual reaffirms the agreement that bought your grandfather's complicity and your family's subsequent ignorance. The water you drink comes from the well that was dug on the Morrison land after their house burned. The candles were blessed with prayers for the souls of the 11 people who died to clear the railroad's path. Eleanor Harrington's figure leaned forward slightly, though her eyes remained unfocused. Your employment with our family was not coincidental, William. We have watched the Foster line for 3 generations, waiting for the appropriate moment to complete the arrangement that your grandfather left unfinished. Thomas Morrison sold his testimony, but he could not sell his family's connection to the land where innocent blood was spilled. That connection passes through bloodlines regardless of name, changes, or geographic relocation. I understood now why I had always felt comfortable in the Harrington mansion, why certain rooms seemed familiar despite being architecturally different from any place I had previously lived. My blood carried memories of different buildings, different landscapes, different lives that had been cut short by men who valued profit over human existence. The Morrison land was consecrated by violence that was never acknowledged, the voices explained. 11 souls were bound to that place by injustice, unable to rest while their deaths remained unwitnessed. Your grandfather's silence created a debt that his descendants must pay until the truth receives proper recognition. The taper in my hand began to grow warm despite having no apparent source of heat. Lendl, William Morrison, they instructed. Complete the ritual that will release your grandfather's testimony from its 93 years of enforced silence. I touched the taper to the candle's wick, and flame appeared without my conscious effort to create it. The moment light flared from the silver holder, the blue room transformed around me. The Persian rugs disappeared, replaced by rough wooden floorboards. The oil portraits became simple whitewashed walls marked by smoke stains. The tall windows overlooking Central Park showed instead a view of rolling hills dotted with sheep, a landscape that looked like pictures I had seen of rural Ireland. The 23 Harrington family members remained in their chairs, but their evening clothes had been replaced by simpler garments. Men in wool jackets and cotton shirts, women in plain dresses with their hair covered by kerchiefs. Their faces, however, were not the faces I recognised from decades of service. These were Irish faces, rural faces marked by outdoor work and simple living. Faces that belonged to people who had never seen New York City, never worn silk or velvet, never owned railroad stock or Manhattan real estate. The Morrison family and their neighbours gathered in the main room of a modest house, waiting for justice that would never come. My grandfather sat among them, his face younger but already marked by the grief that would follow him to America. He looked directly at me with eyes I recognised from my own reflection, eyes that had carried secrets across an ocean and through 3 generations of silence. "Tell them what you saw, Thomas," one of the women said. Her voice was gentle but insistent, carrying the authority of someone who had been patient far longer than anyone should have to be. "Tell them about the men who came with torches, about the railroad agents who paid you to forget our names." My grandfather's voice came through my throat, using my vocal cords to speak words that had been held in silence for nearly a century. I saw them set the fire. I saw them bar the doors from outside so none could escape. I saw them wait to ensure the job was complete before riding away toward the railway camp. The relief that flooded through me was not my own but his. The release of a man who had carried unbearable knowledge for an entire lifetime. I was offered gold to testify that the fire was accident, that the Morrison family died through misfortune rather than murder. I took their money and sailed to America with papers declaring me dead along with my family. But I lived. The voice continued through me. I lived with their gold and their false identity, married a woman who believed my lies about coming from County Cork, raised children who knew nothing of the graves I left behind or the blood money that paid for their American birth. The Morrison family members nodded with satisfaction as my grandfather's testimony filled the room. Their faces showed peace that came from finally being remembered. Finally having their deaths acknowledged as the murders they had been rather than the accidents they had been declared. The railroad was completed using profits from land that was stolen through murder, my grandfather's voice continued. The Harrington fortune was built on graves that were never properly marked, on children who died screaming for help that never came. I signed papers swearing I had seen no evidence of wrongdoing, but I knew the truth until the day I died. And that knowledge poisoned every dollar I spent, every meal I ate, every night I slept in safety they would never know again. Eleanor Harrington's figure dissolved and reformed as a middle-aged Irish woman wearing a simple brown dress and wool shawl. This was not the railroad heiress I had served for 27 years, but rather Eleanor Morrison, Thomas's wife, who had died with her 3 children when the house was barricaded from outside and set ablaze. Our children were 5, 7, and 9 years old, she said in a voice that carried across decades of grief. They called for their father as the smoke filled their lungs. But Thomas was drinking in the village tavern, drowning his sorrows over debts that the railroad agents had secretly arranged to make our land seem desperate for sale. The other faces around the circle resolved into their true identities. Morrison family members and neighbours who had been eliminated to clear the path for railway construction. 11 souls who had waited nearly a century for someone to speak. Their names allowed and acknowledged that their deaths had been planned, executed and covered up by men who valued profit over human life. The monthly rituals, Eleanor Morrison explained, were designed to maintain your grandfather's silence by reinforcing his connection to Harrington guilt. Each gathering strengthened the bonds that kept his testimony buried, ensuring that the Morrison family would remain unremembered and unavenged. But blood calls to blood across generations. And eventually the truth demands acknowledgement regardless of legal documents or financial arrangements. I understood now why the Harrington mansion had always felt familiar, why certain rooms triggered memories I couldn't place, why I had never been able to bring myself to quit this position despite better opportunities elsewhere. The Morrison blood in my veins had been calling me toward this reckoning for 53 years, drawing me to the place where my family's story could finally be told. Your service to the Harrington family, she continued, was your unconscious attempt to balance the scales that your grandfather's silence had disturbed. 27 years of maintaining their comfort, protecting their privacy, enabling their continued prosperity built on Morrison blood. But service cannot replace justice, and comfort cannot erase murder. Thomas Morrison's voice spoke through me one final time. I give my testimony freely now, without coercion or payment. I swear that I witnessed the deliberate murder of the Morrison family by agents acting on behalf of railroad interests. I swear that their deaths were planned, executed, and concealed through bribery and false documentation. I swear that my silence was bought with blood money and maintained through fear. The candle flame grew brighter, casting shadows that moved independently of the figures around the circle. The blue room returned to its familiar appearance, but the 23 figures remained as their true selves, the murdered Morrison family and their neighbours, no longer hidden behind Harrington faces and evening clothes. They sat peacefully in their chairs, their expressions showing the relief of people who had finally been heard after decades of enforced silence. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice returning to my own control. "Now," Eleanor Morrison replied, "you choose how to carry this truth forward. Your grandfather's testimony has been given, but testimony without action remains incomplete. The Morrison family needs more than acknowledgement. We need the justice that was denied when Thomas accepted Harrington gold in exchange for his silence." She gestured toward the crystal glass beside my chair. "The water comes from our well, the well that was dug over the foundation of our burned house. Each monthly ritual forced your grandfather's spirit to drink from the source of his shame, reinforcing his complicity in our erasure. Tonight, you can choose to drink and maintain his silence, or you can choose to pour the water onto the ground and break the cycle that has bound 3 generations of Fosters to Harrington guilt." I lifted the crystal glass and examined the clear water within. It looked perfectly ordinary, but I could sense the weight it carried. 93 years of monthly rituals. Thousands of sips taken by Harrington family members who knew exactly what they were consuming and why the ritual demanded their participation. The water represented more than symbolic connection. It was liquid complicity, distilled guilt, the physical manifestation of an agreement that had turned murder into accident and justice into silence. "If you drink," Thomas Morrison's spirit warned through my consciousness, "you become responsible for maintaining the lie that protected our killers. Your children and their children will be bound to serve the Harrington interests, drawn to protect the wealth that was built on our graves. But if you pour the water out, you break the chain of complicity and free your family line from obligation to our murderers." I stood up from the chair, crystal glass in hand, and walked to the centre of the circle. The 11 Morrison souls watched with expressions of patient hope, while the neighbour spirits nodded their encouragement. For 93 years they had waited for someone from Thomas Morrison's bloodline to make the choice he had been too frightened and desperate to make. "I pour this water for the Morrison family of County Donegal," I said, tilting the crystal glass toward the Persian rug. "I pour it for Eleanor Morrison and her children, for Thomas Morrison's parents, for neighbours who died because they lived on land that railroad men wanted to steal." The water fell from the glass in a stream that caught the candlelight like liquid silver. When it touched the rug, the expensive fabric dissolved, revealing bare earth underneath Irish soil that had somehow remained here beneath 93 years of American flooring, waiting for this moment of acknowledgement. "I testify that their deaths were murder, not accident," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I testify that their killer paid my grandfather to remain silent, and that silence has poisoned my family for 3 generations." The moment the last drop of water touched the Irish soil, the blue room filled with light that came from no electrical source. The Morrison souls rose from their chairs, their forms becoming translucent but somehow more solid at the same time. Eleanor Morrison stepped forward and placed her hand on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of decades lifting from a burden I had carried unknowingly my entire life. "Thank you, William Morrison, she said, using my true name with affection rather than accusation. You have chosen justice over comfort, truth over convenience, and our family can finally rest. The Harrington wealth, Thomas Morrison's spirit added, was built on our graves, but it need not continue to be maintained by our silence. You are released from service to their interests, free to live as Foster or Morrison as you choose, but no longer bound to protect people who profit from our murders. One by one, the 11 souls touched my hand in farewell, each contact bringing memories that belonged to them rather than me. Children playing in Irish meadows, families gathering for evening meals. Simple lives lived in peace until railroad greed required their elimination. I saw their deaths not as distant historical events, but as immediate realities. Understanding finally the full cost of the prosperity I had spent 27 years maintaining. The last spirit to approach was a child of perhaps 7 years old, Eleanor Morrison's youngest daughter, who had died calling for her father as smoke filled her lungs. She looked up at me with eyes that held no anger, only relief. "Will you remember us?" The child asked. "Will you tell people that we lived here before the railroad came, that we had names and families and stories before we were burned to make room for their tracks?" "I will remember," I promised. "I will tell anyone who will listen about Eleanor Morrison and her children, about Thomas Morrison's parents, about neighbours who died because they wouldn't sell their land to killers. And will you tell them," she continued, "that we were not the only ones? That railroad companies burned many families in many counties, and that most of those murders were never acknowledged or punished. The weight of this larger truth settled over me like a heavy coat. The Morrison family represented not just individual tragedy, but systematic violence that had built much of America's transportation network. How many families had been eliminated through accidents that were actually murders? How many graveyards held victims of progress who were never properly mourned or remembered? "I will tell them," I said. "I will research and document and testify about as many as I can find." The child smiled and stepped back into the circle with the other spirits. Together, they began to fade from the blue room, their forms becoming lighter and more translucent until they resembled morning mist touched by sunlight. The Irish soil beneath my feet also began to disappear, revealing the familiar Persian rug. But somehow the ground felt different now, sanctified rather than cursed, peaceful rather than troubled. In the silence that followed their departure, I found myself alone in the blue room with only a burned-down candle and an empty crystal glass to suggest that the night's revelations had been real rather than imagined. But the relief I felt was unmistakably genuine, as was the sense of freedom that came from finally understanding my family's true history. I walked through the Harrington mansion one last time as their employee, seeing it now as the monument to murder it had always been. The railroad fortune that built this house, that paid for the art and furniture and architectural details, that maintained 5 generations of Harrington prosperity all. Of it rested on graves that had been deliberately unmarked and stories that had been systematically silenced. In my apartment above the garage, I wrote my resignation letter by lamplight, explaining that personal circumstances required my immediate departure from their service. I did not explain what those circumstances involved, but I included notice that the blue room would need special cleaning to address water damage to the Persian rug. The letter went on Mrs. Harrington's breakfast tray the next morning, along with house keys and security codes that I would no longer need. By noon, I had packed my belongings and called a taxi to take me to Penn Station, where I purchased a ticket for the first train departing to anywhere that was not New York City. I had spent 53 years living as William Foster. It was time to discover who William Morrison might become, now that his family's story could finally be told. The train carried me north toward Albany, then west toward Buffalo, then beyond into territories I had never seen but that felt somehow familiar. At every station, I found myself looking for historical markers, reading local newspapers, asking elderly residents about railroad construction in their counties during the late 1800s. The stories emerged slowly but consistently. Families who had disappeared during railroad expansion periods. Houses that had burned under suspicious circumstances. Witnesses who had left their communities suddenly after giving testimony that supported railroad claims about accidental deaths and voluntary land sales. In county after county, I discovered Morrison family parallels. People who had stood in the way of transportation development and been eliminated through what were officially recorded as accidents. Suicides, or voluntary relocations but which local memory preserved as murders and cover-ups. Each story I documented felt like placing flowers on a grave that had been unmarked for decades. Most of the victims had descendants who still lived in the areas. Families who had carried whispered stories about great-grandparents who had died in fires, or disappeared on railroad business, but who had never been able to prove what their oral traditions insisted was true. I became an unofficial historian of railroad violence, spending months in each location, researching courthouse records, interviewing elderly residents, mapping patterns of sudden deaths that coincided with transportation construction. The work felt like a calling rather than a choice, as if the Morrison spirits had given me not just freedom from Harrington complicity, but also responsibility for bearing witness to widespread historical crimes in small-town libraries and county historical societies. I found evidence that confirmed my growing understanding. Railroad expansion in the late 1800s had involved systematic violence against landowners who refused to sell their property for the prices offered. These murders were concealed through bribery of local officials, intimidation of witnesses, and destruction of documentation that might have supported victims' families in legal proceedings. The Harrington fortune represented only one example of wealth built on hidden graves. Dozens of railroad families had profited from similar crimes, establishing dynasties that continued to benefit from violence that their ancestors had commissioned but never acknowledged. These fortunes had been laundered through generations of legitimate business activities, charitable donations, and social prominence that obscured their blood-soaked foundations. After 18 months of research and documentation, I began writing letters to newspapers, historical societies, and university researchers, sharing what I had discovered about the systematic nature of railroad violence. Some recipients dismissed my findings as conspiracy theories, but others recognized the patterns I described from their own family histories or local research. Gradually, a network of investigators began collaborating to document cases across multiple states and territories. We shared courthouse findings, interviewed elderly residents who remembered family stories about suspicious deaths, and cross-referenced railroad construction timelines with spikes in accidental fatalities among landowners. The Morrison family story became part of a larger narrative about American expansion that had been deliberately hidden from historical education. Our murdered ancestors joined hundreds of other families whose deaths had enabled the transportation networks that built the modern United States. 5 years after leaving the Harrington mansion, I published a book documenting railroad violence in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois during the period from 1870 through 1900. Blood Money, Hidden Murders in American Railroad Expansion named specific companies, individual executives, and documented cases where families had been eliminated to acquire land for transportation development. The Harrington family's role in Morrison murders occupied only one chapter, but it was supported by courthouse records, witness testimony, and financial documents that traced railroad profits directly to property acquired through systematic violence. Thomas Morrison's original testimony, which I had reconstructed from family memories and documentary evidence, provided crucial proof that these deaths had been planned rather than accidental. Publication brought both vindication and danger. Railroad families whose ancestors were implicated in historical murders hired lawyers to challenge my research, threatened libel suits, and attempted to pressure my publisher into withdrawing the book. But historical societies, university researchers, and descendants of murder victims provided support that allowed the documentation to remain in circulation. More importantly, the book's publication seemed to provide closure for spirits who had waited over a century for acknowledgement. In the towns where I had conducted research, people reported that long-standing local disturbances, houses where families couldn't sleep, businesses where objects moved inexplicably, cemeteries where visitors felt overwhelming sadness, these phenomena, gradually diminished after the murders, were publicly documented, and the victims' names were spoken aloud in contexts that honoured their memory rather than concealing their suffering. Eleanor Harrington died 6 months after my book was published, though I learned of her death only through newspaper obituaries that praised her philanthropy and community leadership without mentioning her family's historical crimes. The mansion on Fifth Avenue was sold to a museum that converted it into exhibition space focusing on Gilded Age wealth and social progress. I attended the museum's opening ceremony, curious to see how the Blue Room would be presented to visitors who knew nothing about Morrison murders or monthly rituals designed to maintain silence about railroad violence. The room had been restored to approximate its 1890s appearance, with period furniture arranged to suggest how wealthy families had entertained during New York's Golden Age. Nothing in the exhibition mentioned the Irish families who had died to build the railroad fortune that paid for the mansion's construction. Nothing acknowledged that the elegant furnishings and architectural details represented profits from systematic murder. Visitors walked through rooms where Thomas Morrison's complicity had been reinforced for 93 years, admiring craftsmanship that was purchased with blood money, completely unaware of the graves that supported their aesthetic appreciation. But I noticed something that the museum curators had missed. The Persian rug in the Blue Room, the same rug where I had poured water from the Morrison well 5 years earlier. The stain where the water had fallen was still visible, though faint, creating a darker pattern in the expensive fabric that looked almost like a map of County Donegal if viewed from the correct angle. Standing in that room as William Morrison rather than William Foster, I felt no anger toward the museum staff or visitors who walked unknowingly over Morrison graves. Their ignorance was not deliberate, and the crimes I had documented belonged to previous centuries rather than contemporary responsibility. What mattered was that the truth had been told, recorded, and made available to anyone who wanted to understand the full cost of American expansion. The Morrison family spirits no longer needed vengeance because they had received acknowledgement. My grandfather's testimony had finally been given without coercion or payment, supported by evidence that proved his original accusations true. The cycle of complicity that had bound 3 generations of Fosters to Harrington interests had been broken through choice rather than obligation. I left the museum carrying copies of my book to distribute to visitors who seemed genuinely interested in learning about the period's social history. Some people thanked me politely and set the books aside, but others read the Morrison chapter carefully and asked questions that suggested they were beginning to understand how much of America's infrastructure was built on hidden graves. These conversations felt like continuing the work that had begun in the Blue Room 5 years earlier. Each person who learned about railroad violence and chose to remember Morrison names became part of the testimony that my grandfather had been too frightened to give. Justice delayed by 93 years was still justice, especially when it included acknowledgement of systematic crimes rather than isolated incidents. I returned to Ireland in my 70th year, using savings from book royalties to visit County Donegal and search for any Morrison. Family graves that might have survived the violence of 1892. Local historians helped me locate the approximate site of the original Morrison homestead. Though railroad construction had long since erased most traces of the buildings that had been destroyed, a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking what had once been Morrison land contained weathered headstones, marking earlier family members who had died before the railroad expansion began. I spent an afternoon cleaning moss from carved names, photographie d'inscription, and adding these peaceful graves to the record of a family whose final generation had died far from this quiet hillside. The well where my grandfather had drawn water for their final months still flowed clear and cold, though it was now surrounded by modern housing rather than sheep pastures. I filled a small bottle with water from this source, thinking of the crystal glasses that had been filled monthly with identical water in the Harrington Blue Room, where Irish water had been used to reinforce American complicity in Irish murders. On my last day in Donegal, I poured this water over the approximate site of the Morrison house, speaking the names of all 11 victims aloud and adding my testimony to Thomas Morrison's, that their deaths were murders rather than accidents, that their killers profited from violence while escaping punishment, and that their descendants had finally learned the truth about family history that had been hidden beneath false names and manufactured stories. The Irish landscape accepted my testimony with the same peace that had filled the Blue Room after the Morrison spirits received acknowledgement 5 years earlier. Wind moved through grass that might have grown from soil enriched by ashes from the burned house, carrying scents of earth and stone that connected present moments to historical tragedies that had been deliberately concealed. I understood finally why the Harrington mansion had always felt familiar despite being architecturally different from any place I had previously lived. The Morrison blood in my veins had been calling me not toward the building itself, but toward the truth that waited within its walls, toward testimony that needed to be given and acknowledgement that needed to be made. My grandfather had chosen silence over justice because he faced impossible circumstances, poverty, grief, and fear that made survival seem more important than bearing witness to murders he could not have prevented. His choice was understandable even if its consequences were tragic, and my role was not to judge his decisions but to complete the testimony he had been unable to give. The work continues today, 40 years after that night in the Blue Room. Railroad violence research has expanded to include other forms of expansion-related murders, mining companies that eliminated Native American communities, lumber corporations that removed entire families from valuable forest land, oil companies that covered up deaths among landowners who refused to lease drilling rights. Each case follows similar patterns: systematic violence disguised as accident or natural cause, witnesses bribed or intimidated into silence, and profits laundered through generations of legitimate business activity until the original crimes are forgotten or dismissed as historical speculation. I write these words in my 81st year. Sitting at a desk I purchased with royalties from 5 books documenting expansion-related violence across the American West. The testimony that began with Thomas Morrison's silence in 1892 has grown into a comprehensive record of systematic murder that enabled much of the nation's transportation, mining, and energy infrastructure. Younger researchers have joined the work, many of them descendants of families who carried whispered stories about great-grandparents who disappeared during development, or died in suspicious accidents that were never properly investigated. Each new case adds detail to our understanding of how violence was concealed and how profits were transferred from murder victims to corporate shareholders, who may never have known about the crimes that funded their prosperity. The Morrison spirits have not visited me again since that night in the Blue Room, but I sense their continued presence in the work itself. The satisfaction that comes from giving voice to people who were silenced by violence. The peace that follows acknowledgement of injustices that were hidden for generations. The hope that future development might proceed without systematic murder because historical examples have been documented and remembered. My grandfather chose silence because he believed survival required complicity with his family's killers. 40 years ago, I chose testimony over silence, truth over comfort, and justice over convenience. That choice freed my children and grandchildren from obligations to wealth built on Morrison graves. But more importantly, it honoured ancestors whose names deserve to be remembered alongside. Acknowledgement that their deaths were neither accidental nor acceptable consequences of American progress. Some estates remain silent, but their walls remember everything, and eventually truth demands voice.